to all of the delegates this afternoon. I am Livia Bonazzi. My substantial role is General Manager, Strategy and Innovation at Western Water. And I am also the Chair of VicWater's Policy Advisory Committee. I am joining you from VicWater Country, and I wish to acknowledge all of the traditional owners of the lands and waters that we treasure. It is my great pleasure to be moderating the following two sessions in this policy and economic stream. The conference so far has been very stimulating, and I have enjoyed seeing everyone else's lockdown hairdos, and you all seem to do a much better job than me. I assume that by now you're all familiar with the foibles of Zoom webinars, but before we begin, allow me to run over some basic housekeeping. But leave your cameras and your microphones are disabled through the webinar. There will be Q&A sessions at the end of each presentation. And to ask a question to the presenter, simply type in the Q&A or the chat function, and I'll be reading out the question to the presenter after the presentation. So please write them in a way that I can make sense of. I have bribed my teenage children, so I hope they don't chew up all of my internet data this afternoon. You may have better ways to keep your connections going and to reduce the buffering. The session today will be recorded, and a link will be provided to watch the replay, I think available from next Monday. And there'll be a 30-minute break at 4:30. So before we move on to the social hour, commencing at 5 o'clock, you don't want to miss that social hour. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Reese Anderson, who is the Regional Business Generation Leader, Environment and Resources for Arup, and Martin Shouler, who is Associate Director for Arup in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Reese and Martin.
Thanks, Olivia. Well, we're really glad to be able to be here this afternoon to present, and I'm just going to load up the slides onto the screen and have Martin kick off.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Rhys. Good afternoon, all. My name is Martin Shouler. I'm joining you from London, and it's quite early in the morning, so excuse the quality of the picture at the moment. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I'm going to take you through our approach for urban water resilience and its understanding and application, the so-called city water resilience approach. So I work for Arup. We are a global engineering consultancy working internationally in sectors such as transport, water and buildings. We're known for many projects, including the Sydney Opera House in Australia that you may be aware of. And I'd like to take you through the city water resilience approach, explain a little about its development and how it's been applied globally. It's very much a collaborative approach. As you can see on the screen here, we've collaborated with a number of organisations to really understand urban water resilience and to help build the city water resilience approach. Just picking up a couple there, OECD based in France, Stockholm International Water Institute, the World Bank and others. And also we've been working very closely with a number of cities, which I'll share with you shortly. Throughout this work, we've been supported by the Resilience Shift. They're a key partner, and they aim to make the world safer through resilient infrastructure. So as you'll be aware, existing infrastructure systems are increasingly complex and interdependent. These systems are under pressure from growing demands such as population growth, accelerating urbanization, and climate change. And they have become fragile as a result of fragmented governance and a lack of investment. And we are now operating very much in an increasingly uncertain future. And TRS builds its work around these three key pillars: influencing policy, shaping practice, and shared learning. And hopefully you'll see how CWRA fits into these pillars. So CWRA is very much part of a wider program within the water sector, where we're looking to convert knowledge and experience into new approaches and tools in order to facilitate industry change. So as you see, as you move around that circle on the screen, you can see some of the products that we've developed in order to affect that industry change. So the city water resilience approach has been some time in the making. Nearly 10 years ago, Arup launched the City Water Resilience Approach, the City Resilience Index. And since then, we've been working with clients and collaborators in order to develop a focus on water. And this then led to the CWRA, as you can see on the right-hand side of that slide. So all of those pieces of work help to influence and build the CWRA. So every city faces different water challenges, and the CWRA approaches that very agnostic in terms of the city, in terms of understanding shocks and stresses, but then adapts that in terms of the particular requirements for that particular city. And it really helps leaders to address those issues. So a changing climate coupled with urbanization has resulted in unpredictable rainfall, flooding, droughts, and other water-related shocks and stresses on cities. And some 2 billion new urban citizens are moving into cities over the next period from now until 2050. So across the world, decision makers are focused on the central role of water and how it plays into cities, and the need to adapt for an uncertain future. So to date, CWRA has been applied in 8 cities globally, and you can see them on the screen there. So our thanks go to those cities, and now we're beginning to build CWRA in a further 3 cities in Africa from now through to the middle of next year. So as we go through, every city provides us new learning, and we build that into the CWRA approach. And very much so, the methodology was engineered from the ground up. So we undertook a comprehensive literature review at the beginning of the work to understand the art of urban water resilience. And then we went into the field and worked in 8 cities across the globe to understand, what does urban water resilience mean to those cities? And we use that to build that into the CWR approach. And so we've uncovered close to 16,000 factors which either hinder or help urban water resilience. So we collated them and built them into 56 sub-goals and 12 higher level goals. And together they form the CWRA and one of its tools, the framework. So on the right-hand side, you can see that we've got 62 qualitative indicators and 40 quantitative indicators that build the framework. And that's one of the tools that we use for the CWRA. So in essence, the CWRA is a 5-step process which allows cities to understand their water-related risks and really helps shape implementation plans. And as I've mentioned, it's supported by a number of tools, the framework, and another tool called Our Water, which I'll return to shortly. So most recently, the City Water Resilience approach has been applied in Cape Town, in Miami. And I will take you through some of the learning through the 5 steps that we've deployed in both of those cities. Next slide, please. So step 1 of the 5-step program is really, the first one is setting the scene and understanding the system. So every city is different. So we really begin with an in-depth research to understand the relevant shocks and stresses that an area faces. And our focus is to understand the answer to 3 questions at this stage. Who are the key stakeholders? What are the interdependencies between systems? And what is the relevant infrastructure? So as part of that, we've developed an online tool called Our Water to help us. So Our Water is a tool that helps us understand the relationships between stakeholders and the water cycle for a particular city. So on this screen, you can see some of the cities that we've been working with. And I'll quickly take you through Cape Town, which has been pre-populated because that's work that we did last year. So on here, this first screen shows some of the key assets on with the water cycle. And you can zoom into those assets and look at the interconnections between them. So here you can see the catchment areas. You can see some of those assets such as dams, where water is abstracted, hydro systems, and importantly, the end users, and understand how they're all in an interconnected system. So moving through this, you're able to interrogate each of these boxes to understand what those assets are, how they operate, who the key stakeholders are, and I'll quickly show you how to do that. So using the filters, we can filter on a category such as the end users, and we can shine a light on those and understand how they connect into other assets, how they link. So if I go into one of those asset groups more deeply, let's look at catchment areas. So let's look at the Berg River catchment. Here on this screen, you can see a little bit of information about the asset, but also importantly, you need to understand the shocks and stresses that that asset's operating under. You can look at the key stakeholders, who they are, and click through. And so this becomes quite a powerful tool to allow many stakeholders to coalesce around the water cycle for a city. This can be set up for a municipal water company. You can include other city stakeholders. And with different editing rights, you can allow end users to populate the model, bringing in their own expertise and understanding. You can add new stresses and shocks. And then you can see how all of those relate to the stakeholders. So quite importantly within a water cycle is understanding the who's who within the water cycle. How strong are those links? Who the key players are and what those relationships are. You can then zoom into a particular stakeholder, in this particular case, the city of Cape Town. And this slide here just shows the strength with these numbers, how many connections we have with other key stakeholders. So really understanding where the strengths and weaknesses lie, the overlaps and underlaps. Rhys, if we can stop that now, thank you. So step 2, once you've understood the basin that the city sits within, the key stakeholders, then you go on to understand and assess urban water resilience. And to do that, you use the City Water Resilience Framework. Each one of the goals and indicators are developed and worked through in a workshop environment. So what you're doing is bringing together various knowledge and experience within the stakeholder groups that you've identified. You're bringing community groups together to understand the strengths and weaknesses within that water cycle and the assets. You make an assessment between optimal and poor, and you do that a number of times and bring that information together. Very much guided through in a workshop environment, very open and understanding. So if you move through, once you've attempted that, what you do is you populate the City Water Resilience Framework wheel. And what I'm showing here are the completed wheels for Cape Town and Miami. So each one of these spokes of the wheel is a sub-goal, which you've assessed, the community has assessed as either weak or strong. And I want to draw to your attention is that although Cape Town and Greater Miami are experiencing very different shocks and stresses on their water cycle, Cape Town has recently gone through day 0 and extreme drought. Miami is having flooding instances and it's challenged by sea level rise. You can see here with the blue dots around the wheel, they're actually experiencing very similar underlying issues. And I draw that to your attention because there's an ability for cities to learn from each other, to understand what are the underlying issues behind some of the shocks and stresses that they're experiencing in the water cycle. Which brings me to city learning. And we found that it's really powerful bringing cities together to discuss the shocks and stresses and urban water resilience problems that they are experiencing within their city. And we found that one example between Cape Town and Miami, as I mentioned, Cape Town's just recently gone through day 0 extreme drought, but they had a very sophisticated communication program with their citizens they put in place to manage the consumption of water. And Miami was very keen to understand how that could be applied to some of their programs for flooding and sea level rise. So you can see some of the underlying issues to strengthen urban water resilience can be brought together, and that city-to-city learning is really powerful and should be encouraged. The next step is, once you've understood what the urban water resilience challenges are, is then effectively to move to develop an action plan. And again, this is a very structured approach where we take our learning that we've developed in stages 1 and 2 to understand the urban water shocks and stresses, to turn those into problem statements and really examine the root causes of these problems, which might be systemic, they might be around governance, they might be around investment, or they may be around some of the engineering issues. Take those problem statements and root causes and turn them into an opportunity. And we do that with some of the key stakeholders that we've identified in stages 1 and 2. And again, we use a workshop environment to workshop through those and understand how some of those interventions could possibly strengthen urban water resilience. So just a couple of the interventions that were identified in Cape Town to collectively, data was seen as a key asset in terms of strengthening urban water resilience. And perhaps that wasn't one of the key issues that was identified before this work. So what they've gone on to do is develop a data and information platform for understanding water use and consumption. These key action plans are now making their way through to the resilience plan for the city. So they're funded. So from this work, we've actually got actionable outcomes. Also, you'll see that human capacity and development is important. And it was identified that operators required new training. So new training requirements were identified, and an adaptive master's program has been created. Governance was a key issue in terms of understanding urban water resilience. And the city wants to mainstream water sensitive design principles. And so they're moving from grey infrastructure to blue-green hybrids. So these actions have been effectively taken, developed and socialized with the key stakeholders, because they've helped create them in the first place. And that made it easier to land them in the city water resilience plan, owned by the city, funded by the city and others. I'm going to hand on now to Rhys to go through some of the work that we've been doing in Australia.
Thanks, Martin. My aim really is just to touch on a couple of projects or really where this approach is starting to be utilized within the Australian context. And so the first one I'll just touch on very briefly is with respect to scenario development for Southeast Queensland. And it effectively was commissioned by AECOM Water to prepare for their next version of the water security program and to develop a set of possible futures to frame the adaptive planning that they were doing. So in collaboration with a number of the industry stakeholders, we developed 6 unique scenarios for possible futures for Southeast Queensland, and resilience was a key element of this. Just focusing on one of those things, for example, was one of those scenarios was power to the people. And in this one here, the main influence on this was around resilience, but in a circumstance where population was booming across southeast Queensland, competition between utility providers, bundled offerings of different products or services being offered, and the way that resilience can be sought or provided through these sorts of scenarios. So this is just one example of the sort of scenario that we're talking about. And one of the key components of this work was also looking at the emissions trajectory and what the impact of climate change was going to be in these sorts of scenario planning. I'm mindful of time, so I'll just move to the next one. For Sydney Water, we've recently been developing a systems resilience framework, and this was effectively providing guidance on how to embed resilience into the decision-making process. So applying a number of the processes that Martin's just talked about around the stakeholder engagement, understanding and mapping the stakeholders across the water cycle. We undertook a resilience framework review, and ultimately to be able to assess options in the delivery of capital programs, those options that would provide greater resilience to the water supply system. And so that was an important component of the overall evaluation of those systems. I reflect on that. One of the first slides that Martin showed was a timeline from 2012 to today, and note that across that program, there have been different components of work that have been done in Australia, including some responsibility mapping, like our water tool in Melbourne as well. And so a lot of the resilience work has been built up over time, over these different elements. And I'll just hand back over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Rhys. Yeah, I just wanted to end really just with a call to action. So at last year's International Water Conference in Stockholm, a number of organisations came together to discuss urban water resilience, and some of them are shown on this slide. But we felt that it was very much a collective effort, and we've made all our tools and processes open source. Very important that we publish this work, which enables others to pick it up. And there have been other actors have been picking up the CWRA and applying it. But also we identified that there was a number of other useful tools and processes that organisations have been developing. And we wanted to bring them together because this is such an important issue that there's so much work to be done in this area that we can certainly collaborate rather than compete on this issue. So if anybody is interested in being involved in a community practice, I'd be very pleased to hear from you. And there's others who are joining us on this journey because I think it very much is a journey, and we're not at the end of this yet. And there's still learning and new practices to bring into this space. So I will end with that there. So thank you very much for your attention. If you've got any questions, we'd be very pleased to hear from you, or contact either Rhys or myself directly, and we'd be happy to take you through anything you've seen during this presentation. And all of the tools and processes are available either on the Arup website or the Resilient Shift website, so you can just have a look on there. And again, very pleased to answer any queries you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin and Rhys. You really drove the message home that building city, water resilience is a terribly urgent and important collective obligation. We've got a couple of questions. I'd like to start with one of my own, if you don't mind. Either Martin or Rhys. Where else do you see, or are you seeing the uptake of city water resilience approach around the world?
I'll take that if I may. So I alluded to 3 cities that we are now undertaking assessments in Africa. So the German government have invited us to look at Addis Ababa, Kigali, and another city in South Africa. So we're beginning to move to that important area of the world. Other cities that we're working with include interest from New York, interest from enduring interest from Hull in the UK, and we've had lots of inquiries. So there's a sort of capacity issue as well, that we need to bring others into this space and into this thinking, because I think there's more good work that we could do collectively using this approach, and bring other actors into this place. So lots of interest. It's getting the word out there. But again, you'll see from the steering group, we've got lots of friends who are helping us to promote CWRA, including the World Bank and OECD. So the word's getting out there, and I think the cities are speaking for CWRA. So Cape Town has promoted the work, and I think that's why we'll be working in Africa next. So it's really kind of word of mouth and us promoting it through forums like this.
And we've got a question from Neville about the City Water Resilience Index, who would like to explore how this index complements the CRC for water sensitive cities, that index work that has been completed internationally and in Australian benchmarking cities against similar urban water indicators.
Yes, very good question, Neville. Thank you. So we met with the water sensitive cities team probably last year now, well, certainly just before lockdown, to discuss how we could integrate the two systems more fully. So we don't see these systems being competitive. They're very much complementary. The agreement at the time was to look to adapt both systems to provide cities with much better understanding. So there's some fantastic work that the team have done at CRC, WSC, and it's really about integrating those two systems together. So very much complementary, looking to see how we can do more together in the future. And perhaps one of the things that we did discuss is actually working on a city perhaps in Southeast Asia, unfinished business from our, so we need to get on with and do more work there. So
do you think there is an opportunity for cities to learn from each other in terms of resilience? And how can we facilitate?
Yes, so I alluded to that in my presentation. We have had a global knowledge share where we brought cities together to work through some of their challenges. And it became very clear at that point is that although the challenges manifest in different ways, either extreme drought, we were seeing that many of the underlying issues are common. And so that's where cities can really get together and understand things like governance, investment, understand training, human capacity. So really learning to build urban water resilience from the bottom up. And lots of those relationships are enduring. We're capturing that learning, and we hope to have another one of those events in the near future. The other thing is that we put all our knowledge and experience online. So as we build these tools and some of this understanding, we bring that into those online tools. And that's part of the reason also was that the call to action to develop this community of practice came from the cities, because they felt that actually that was somewhere they could get that knowledge extracted a global community, which is super important, that learning comes from everywhere. So the global north, the global south actually can really learn from each other. So that was one of the key points that came out of our work over the last 2 or 3 years.
So the scenarios, the different RCPs for Australia, and what was the source of climate scenario data?
I think that's a question to me on the couple of examples that I showed. So yeah, we did look at the different possible climate change scenarios, utilizing CSIRO projections and other sort of the I guess accepted scientific scenarios, including IPCC and the like. So I didn't obviously go into detail around the specific climate change scenarios that were involved, but yeah, they all we're effectively looking at the impact of high, medium, and low changes in climate.
And we've got a question from Rosemary about if you can expand a bit on how you build resilience into project planning.
Martin, I might take that one to start with.
Yeah, please feel free. Yeah.
So Livia, one of the things that I think can be done quite easily and quite effectively is the use of the Our Water tool that Martin mentioned before, which is available online, and anyone can use it and set up their system or their city, and utilize that tool to identify stakeholders early on in a project and how they interact or influence with the particular asset or group of assets that you might be planning around. So if you're planning around a particular reservoir, dam, treatment plant, and the interconnecting pipes or whatever it might be in between those things, you can utilize the Our Water tool to identify which of those stakeholders are integral or influenced or influential in that particular asset, and then utilize that to work with that stakeholder about if you were to change or to modify that treatment plant or the reservoir or the dam, or if they're to do some works as well, how that might impact on the resilience of that system. So that's one way to do it. Martin, any other thoughts on that as well?
No, just building on that. Thanks, Rhys. I mean, it's really to take a deeper dive into those shocks and stresses and understand what the risk and likelihood of some of those shocks hitting that system. So it's understanding that sort of resilience engineering from the very outset. So doing that homework first, really understanding those scenarios, and then putting your asset, but also put your asset through that and understand its interdependencies with other systems. So many water assets are going to be dependent on power systems. They're all dependent on communication systems. They're all dependent on transport systems. They're all dependent on operators getting to the asset. So understand fully that we live in a very connected world, and how does your particular asset or system fit into that much bigger ecosystem, and understand what happens if that system fails. So resilience is not just about protecting an asset, it's understanding if that asset fails, what are the knock-on effects and how can you mitigate them? And then how do you recover from that event? So resilience really much is an end-to-end process. It's not just about ensuring a particular asset is strong, can resist shocks and stresses. It's about understanding how it fits into a much bigger ecosystem of connected and interdependent assets.
Thank you very much, Rhys and Martin. I think the presentation and your answers also highlighted the fact that we cannot leave city water resilience up to chance, but it is really a collective obligation to plan for. That's up for the time. I think the next presentation is due now, and I'd like to thank you again. And I'll introduce the next presenters from AECOM. And the presentation has been pre-recorded, and the video features the following speakers: Mike Andrews, who's the Director of Water, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania at AECOM, and Robert Spencer, who's the Director of Sustainable Development at AECOM UK. Afterwards, we will have Mike and Frederick Blinn with us for the Q&A. And Frederick Blinn is the team leader of AECOM's Strategic Asset Management and Advanced Materials team in Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Andrews and I head up AECOM's Water and Asset Management team covering Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Joining us from his holiday in France from our UK and Ireland team, which is the reason why we're doing the video today, just in case the internet at his holiday accommodation fails, is Robert Spencer, and he's our Director for Sustainable Development. Although I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people in Melbourne. And I'm joining you today from Perth, so the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects to elders both past and present who have nurtured and continue to nurture the land, the Burrung, which is the Yarra River, and the Derbal Yarragan, which is the Swan River, the animals, and the community. One of the advantages of working in an organisation such as AECOM is our global spread. You'll see the numbers on the screen there. So the white numbers illustrate the number of employees in each region, and the black numbers illustrate the number of water professionals in each region. And then from left to right, for clarity, so we've got the Americas, we've got what we call EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and then APAC with ANZ, which is in the bottom right-hand corner. What this offers us is an ability to share the insights that we've delivered from similar projects in different locations and environments, share strategies that are developed to overcome risks and opportunities in those locations, and share smarts that we can transfer from one context to another. During my time at AECOM, I've engaged our US team, bringing process engineering expertise for treatment plants, which have had specific source water quality issues. Used our Denver-based dams team, which is massive. It's like 1,000 people. Ridiculous, really, the number of people in the dams team over there in Denver. And also the UK team, where we brought program management smarts, water network smarts, and asset management innovations as well. And there is more. And what we do is we base that through our technical practice network, our TPN, which is a network built on the desire for technical excellence and the sharing of best practice. And these are really aligned to the client's ambitions, which led me to this gentleman who I'll now introduce. As part, next slide, as part of the preparation for the bid, the TPN led me to discovering Robert and the CE work he and his colleagues had done in the UK and Europe. So set up a conference call. But before I get into that, I thought I'd reflect a little bit on how CE has become more of a cultural component of our organisation rather than a function and add on to what we do. So the CE label, the circular economy label, is, Richard advises me, something that's been around for 30 to 40 years. I don't remember this 30 years ago. And there are some, thinking back, there are some examples from my early career where CE was more of a product of challenging the ways that we worked. My experience predominantly is in operations and maintenance, and in those early days, I remember being a young engineer when a guy called John Ringham, some of you may know him, he was the ex-CEO at SA Water, he was my boss in the UK at the time. He asked me to look at making our civil maintenance crews as efficient as possible, along with being safer and having a greater customer focus and so on. And so this is a really simple example of water industry and circular economy. So when you're carrying out maintenance, whether it's a burst or a leak or whatever, and there's an excavation required, in those days you would send out your first crew, they would excavate, repair, import fresh sand bed along with limestone, put a temporary surface and material on top, cart away and send the excavated material to landfill. And then a number of days later, a second crew would come along, excavate, add more imported backfill in, compact, put a permanent blacktop finish on, cart the spoil away and send that to landfill as well. And that was more or less a process that had been done for years. So the solution that I came up with was through a single crew. So excavate, repair, sand bed, then selected backfill from what had been excavated, compaction, and then the use of a new product that went by the snappy title of permanent coal-laced surface and material, which was PCSM. And remember, this is in the mid to late 90s. So it was a change in how we'd worked. So that was a single visit, so low use of fuel, less production of greenhouse gases, reduced use of new natural resources, so minimum imported materials, and therefore reduced landfill, reduced costs, reduced exposure to safety issues, and minimized disruption to the customer and community. So just for clarity, the CE benefits that I've just outlined, they weren't the drivers. They were just a byproduct. The real driver at that point was affordability and lower unit rates. So to continue with the introduction and give us a clear understanding of what CE includes, I thought I'd make reference to Accenture's business models, which are as good as any I've seen. So there they are on screen. So the circular supplies, and I think people instinctively think about circular supplies when they think about circular economy. So I gave so the company that I was working for, the example I gave earlier about the repair and maintenance, United Utilities, they then later turned their heads more purposefully towards CE and environmental benefits. So in the early 2000s, they established the largest wastewater dewatering and sludge incineration facility in the UK. It's called Shell Green, producing renewable energy while reducing landfill. And then locally, we do have other examples as well, such as Yarra Valley's waste to energy project, where organic waste bound for landfill is diverted as fuel for renewable energy, which is great. The next, resource recovery. So there are examples in the industry at the moment, so leading edge technologies, where, for example, we recover struvite, which is a valuable fertilizer from seawater or concentrate streams. And I'm aware of a trial going on in Western Australia at the moment. Hopefully that'll prove to be a positive business case. Then product as a service, and there's lots of examples of this in business, vehicles, plant equipment, and so on, and even in day-to-day life. So pay-to-use examples, again, vehicles, goods, even music, although maybe showing my age, I still buy vinyl records. And then product life extension. So I've got a whole team who specializes in smart asset management, and I'll introduce later Frederick Blinn. His team focus on life cycle asset management, asset assessment and optimization, durability and information management. And then finally, sharing platforms, and that's really the basis of VicWater, from my understanding. Water corporations collaborate and working better together. And so that could be seen as really a CE business model. So when Robert, Frederick and I were discussing this topic, we made the observations about how organizations had matured, processes changed, mindsets had changed, and even society had obviously got more and more of focus on CE now. And in support of that, in an industry where wastewater process engineers now expect to be called resource recovery engineers, well, we seem to be doing something right. So to introduce Robert, my question was, could you provide insights and your understanding of circular economy agenda in Europe? So over to you, Robert.
Thanks very much indeed, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. So I'm Robert Spencer. I'm going to give you some insights from the work that I've been doing with infrastructure, asset owners and operators over the last few years. And Mike's story about the trenches and so on, and getting materials in and out and in a much more asset efficient way reminded me of one of the projects I cut my teeth on. So I started out in this area way back in 2005, working on a project funded by the British Department for the Environment, the National Industrial Symbiosis Program, another big mouthful. I think we'd just call it a circular economy program now. But I was working with a farming company down in Andover, and they got a big pile of pea shingle that they've been using for watercress production, and they scraped it off each year and generating a big legacy pile. They were concerned about leaching and possible environmental impact, so contacted NISP, which is the acronym for the program I worked for, and we fixed them up with some aggregate processors who came in, took the pea shingle away, cleaned it up, and sold it on into the aggregate recycling market. And actually it was picked up by some of the water utilities. Of course, you guys will know pea shingle is a great pipe bedding material, and so that found its way back into the economy. So a great example of resource recovery in operation. So a lot of the examples that I've got from understanding circular economy in the last few years has been through a couple of working groups that I run at AECOM. These are best practice forums for infrastructure owners and operators. We've got the major infrastructure resource optimization group, which sort of grew out of NISP, which I was working on. And then more recently, we founded the Scottish Infrastructure Circular Economy Forum back in 2017 for the infrastructure owner and operators north of the border. And these have been fantastic forums. And some of the insights that I'm going to give, Mike, actually come from working with these folks, sharing best practice, seeing what's worked with one organization, and then trying to roll that out and scale that up with others. And it really is all about collaboration. So I think this opportunity with VicWater of sharing practice and learning about circular economy in this context is so valuable. That's exactly what's been working for us. If we jump to the next slide. One of the first things that we started working on with the MyROG group was procurement. And we actually came up with our first white paper on this, a thought leadership paper that we put out into the market, a sort of voice of the infrastructure operators on the need to get circular economy integrated into procurement really early on. So really early on in the process, engaging the supply chain and the value chain to drive this into normal business operations. And of course, the water utilities, just like some of the other infrastructure asset owners and operators, can really send a strong market signal through their procurement approaches, setting out specific questions that will challenge the contractors and the consultancy supply chain and the value chain to come up with innovation, looking at some of those business models that Mike was talking about and bringing that in so that you're actually driving the approach. If you jump to the next slide, then we've got the procurement fish. And this simply shows the amount of value that you gain from getting in significant circular economy thinking during your preparatory stage, when you're initially doing your optioneering, your feasibility, you're starting to crystallize your scope. That's when you can really lock in your sustainability gains. And of course, your circular economy approach is a big part of that. And as your specifications get fixed, the opportunities further on in the life cycle for changing things and improving sustainability outcomes are diminished. So one of the second papers, the second paper that we looked at MyROG was around thought leadership on performance. And this is, I should say, performance at the organizational level. So there's lots of good examples of circular economy practice at the product and asset and component level, you know, things like disassembling mobile phones and white goods and that kind of thing. But at the organizational level, how do you drive that performance and actually see how you're doing? What kind of metrics and indicators can you use? So we chunked these up into three categories just to make things a bit easier for ourselves. And they kind of cut across leading and lagging. So you've got your leading, your enabler indicators or KPIs. Here you're looking at procurement. You're looking at how many initiatives you might have implemented with circular economy. You're looking at a proportion of your assets or asset components that have next life plans or that are using condition-based monitoring, as Mike was suggesting. Then at the impact level, these are starting to get into lagging, so you kind of report on this stuff on a quarterly or yearly basis. You're looking at how much waste you generated, landfill diversion, water use, typical resource intensity, consumption metrics. And then you're looking at attribution. So you're looking at your sort of throughput. How much value, how much resource have you extracted for the value that you've created? And obviously you're trying to get that ratio really tight so that you're creating more value from less raw material extraction. So there are some of the attributes that you could look at. And one of the things that we've talked about as well is the fact that you really need a platform for sharing all this information. You can only really get that example I gave at the beginning with Vitacrest and Thames Water, one of the utilities sharing pea shingle. That only happened because both ends knew about that data point, and that was facilitated. Now nowadays we've got digital platforms to do this. You know, back in 2007-8, we didn't have anything like the amount of platforms and apps that you can use now to exchange data and understand what's going on in real time around resource optimization. But now we can. And I think one of the things that we're working on with some funding from Network Rail actually in the UK is the resource exchange mechanism idea. So that's about working with the infrastructure utilities the transport, utilities, energy, and putting materials on there which are redundant or underutilized or available, and then making sure that you can get a match. And I often say data is the best friend of the circular economy, because it allows you to actually work out where things are, what their condition is, what liabilities they've got, what warranties they've got, and you can make the links and get the resources back into use. So white paper 4, we just brought this one out, and this comes back to some of the points that Mike was talking about, actually, in terms of business models, looking at partnerships, looking at policies and standards, and looking at data and targets. It's really looking at the big picture here and thinking about the fact that many organizations, governments, regional governments, cities, organizations, private sector companies and utilities have set themselves really challenging net zero goals, so net zero by 2050, 2040, 2030, even some of the most ambitious. And circular economy approaches are actually a very good way of getting your work processes underway to meet those goals. And these are the kinds of approaches that we've taken. So, looking at your business models, looking at your procurement, your asset baselines, that point about collaborating, using digital solutions, jointly committing to drive ambition and bring everyone along behind you, the collaboration piece there, and working with government and local authorities to get policy standards, working with environmental protection agencies and so on to change or update approaches so that, regulations and standards aren't getting in the way of bringing viable resources back into resource use. That's one of the big challenges we've had in the UK, and we're working really closely with the Environment Agency and the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency on that, and they're both members of the two forums I highlighted earlier. And then data and targets, those key drivers. You've got to bring that data under management and then work towards improving performance against it. And then we've got the SciSEF, the Scottish Infrastructure Circular Economy Forum, and what they've done here is really just mapped out a route to getting circular economy implemented much more widely across infrastructure projects in Scotland. So there's a lot of small print in here. I'm not going to expect you to read that or indeed take the detail from that. But the point I want you to take away from here is it's good to map out a way forward, put some timelines there, put some goals and targets there, and work out how you're going to get from A to B in terms of your circular economy sort of maturity or journey. This has been very valuable working with organisations like Transport Scotland, and they're taking a lot from that and they're getting that underway. So that really concludes the white papers. They're all available on the AECOM website. If you Google MyROG or SciSEF, they'll come up straight away. So I wanted to just give a bit of an insight into what's going on more broadly in Europe. Of course, you may have heard that the European Commission has been working on a circular economy package for some time now. I think early work on this started in 2015-16, and this has driven a lot of interesting activity. You're looking at things like driving the white goods manufacturers and mobile phone companies to make their products possible to disassemble and refurbish and recycle and reuse much more effectively. And what we're finding, even despite Brexit, actually, the UK is going to transpose a lot of that circular economy package into law, into the UK as well. In Scotland, you've already got a circular economy strategy issued and a number of other circular economy policy drivers underway. So we're going to see quite a lot of activity on this in terms of policy and legislation in the next 2 to 3 years. And linking that back to the green economy boost that France and Germany and the UK are rolling out as part of the post-COVID recovery. In fact, I think France has just announced some very big funding, billions into getting this sort of stuff underway, particularly focused around energy. And what I wanted to focus on here was, from my mind, the Dutch approach in the Netherlands, that they've really taken this to the next level. I think if I was looking across Europe and thinking, okay, which is the country that's really done the most to drive circular economy into their regulations and sending a strong market signal from the government policy lead, then it is the Dutch. And this is a model that I've seen that they're promoting across government, rethinking the needs, finding non-material solutions, so actually preventing the need. That's kind of like the no-build idea. Then retaining value, prolonging the life of assets, reusing existing assets, and then creating value through the sort of business model approaches, new materials, innovations, the kinds of things that we've been talking about earlier. So really good example. If you want to sort of see, you know, where Europe's going, then, you know, look at the Dutch, I think, on circular economy, because they're doing good work. If you jump to the next slide, there's actually a really good example from one of the key asset managers in Holland, the VicWater rather. They're looking at, you know, they've put in these ambitions, you know, 2030, they want to be completely circular, and they're focusing on preserving and reusing materials, circular design, data systems, the materials passports, that idea of knowing the identity. There's the famous quote, actually, waste is simply a material without an identity. I think an architect came up with that, but it's a good one. And as soon as you get a passport, your material's got an identity. So in other words, it's kind of like an environmental product declaration, but with a bit more detail about what that material could be used for going forward. And then circular economy procurement, we've talked about that. So we're onto a good track there. And I think if we just look at the next slide, we're starting to wind up the presentation now. I'm just going to take you through some really quick examples. So for the old Oak, the Park Royal Old Oak Common development, just outside of on the west of London near Heathrow, lots of interchanges with Crossrail, High Speed 2, and possible extension of roads into Heathrow and so on. Big new development. There they've taken an integrated water management strategy approach, which is kind of like, I think, you know, circular economy at the spatial level. How can you get the most value from the water that you've got in the area? And this is using work from Carl Pelling at AECOM. You're looking at wastewater flows, you're looking at recycling water, you're looking at maximizing green services for evapotranspiration, you're looking at maximizing green roofs, source control measures with development plots, dispersing discharge management stormwater, so you're spreading out stormwater, a whole bunch of different things to A, mitigate too much water at once, and B, mitigate water scarcity during times of excess heat. Fantastic example there, well worth looking that one up. So then we've got hot sticky socks. So this is a lovely one. It reminds me of the story Mike gave at the beginning, actually. So instead of you know, you've got a problem with your sewerage pipe. You guys might be familiar with this one already, but it's an example I like. Instead of, you know, digging up the whole pipe, all that backfilling and taking materials away and bringing them back again, this is using a hot resin emplacement inside the tube. So you just need 1 or 2 intervention points. Effectively, you're relining the sewer with the heated resin. That then cools down, and you've got a brand new sewer without having to go through those interventions. So a great circular economy solution there from a company called Aqualiner, working with Wessex Water. This example came from Dan Green at Wessex Water. Next slide. And then Yorkshire Water, one of our key clients in the UK. They've got a big plant, water treatment works at Esholt near Bradford. They're trying to drive a lot of their, they've sort of taken a pilot or a pathfinder approach with this water treatment plant, and they're doing everything they can around circular economy to see what can be scaled across their water utility network. So they're looking at renewable energy from sludge. They're looking at processing redundant filter for use in place of virgin aggregate. And they're looking more broadly at the whole, because it's a housing development as well next door. They're looking at redeveloping the operationally redundant areas, bringing them back under control, looking at new approaches around water energy, water networks to really make that a really impressive sustainability resource use site. So I just need to round up the presentation now. So we're just going to look to one more slide, I think. The circular economy business model from AECOM. So this is something that I'm happy to follow up with people on afterwards. This was developed by our buildings team. Dave Cheshire published this model in REBA, but again, if you look from the center and move out, basically you're trying to keep everything in the center, and you've got a number of different business models, not too dissimilar from the Accenture one, but focused more on infrastructure. So building in layers, designing out waste, designing for adaptability, designing for disassembly, and selecting your materials. Fantastic model. Best to use it actually in anger, so you can sort of see how it works. And finally, I think a quick matrix that helps us understand how to do circular economy work with our clients. I've used this, and it basically ranges from down your y-axis, you're looking at organization down to component and everything in between. And then you're looking at your circular economy principles or models across your x-axis, across the top. What can you design out? What can you design for disassembly? How can you make it more adaptable? What materials you're selecting, getting rid of waste and using it as a resource, and then thinking about your business models. And that pretty much winds us up, I think. If we can jump to the next slide. I just want to finish by saying that we're literally only a Teams call away. Really keen to work with you on this. If you've got questions, I'll happily field them next week as well, once we're back online. And meanwhile, Mike and Frederick will be with you for the Q&A. Bye for now.
Hello again. I believe we have Mike and Frederick Green online now. Please pass on our commiserations to Robert, holidaying in the south of France, missing out on all of the action here in Victoria. I think we should leave some of the hard questions for him to answer. Let me start with one of my questions. What are the next steps for circular economy in the water industry?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, Livia. I think we do need to recognise that there are business as usual circular economy solutions that are in place. We've seen some great advanced projects too over the years, but you know, on the base level, we do have a history of maximising the value of wastewater, reclaimed water, for irrigation and non-potable reuse and environmental flows and things like that, and obviously developed biosolid strategies, and now we're pushing technology, as I referred to before, to recover resources for plant fertilizer and things like that. There are other examples as well, which are very local to where you are today. So the Yarra Valley Water's waste to energy project, or project should I say, great examples, and there are similar examples across Australia. Just down the road again, Southeast Water's Aqua Revo, which is a great example of decentralized smart water management systems. And then we've got the use of material, which does touch on some of the stuff that we've talked about so far. But in terms of the next big thing, I think, for the industry, I think it's more of a, maybe an enterprise scale, organizational level application of CE. So the embedment of the values and the strategies and the culture. So it is just what we do. So it's more of that organizational approach, which I think is the next thing for us. And obviously some companies have made those initial steps. I think the next steps though will be to progress those policies, including procurement. Ultimately, we do need to encourage suppliers and others to progress CE, which will drive change. So the best way to start is to start, and you know, an example is the asset bases that the water corporations have, and almost taking that circles model, which Robert referred to before, the retain, refit, refurbish, and the other rewords, which I can't quite recall at the moment, but you know, and then sort of adopting those and getting that thinking right at the beginning. So again, referring back to that fish diagram that Robert referred to earlier, and maybe ultimately.
And for the record, Western Water also has a food waste to energy facility at the Melton treatment plant.
Yeah.
What could be the first solid step forward that the water utility in Victoria could take towards enabling a CE?
Yeah, no, good question. And I think given the context in the forum, you know, given the membership and the benefit of combined thought leadership, noting that some of them, as Mike said before, have actually progressed some of the CE steps, there definitely, in our opinion, will be some benefit in developing some kind of maturity assessment of the industry and all the organizations at the individual level, and mapping out an implementation plan. And this is something that, you know, we do quite a lot in asset management, and, you know, maturity assessment, looking at where you are, where you want to be, and how you get there. And in that process, it would be good to have the regulator involved, and looking at how to recognize the value and the benefits from actually adopting these strategies. And on that, it's important to also look at the conversion of non-financial capital into financial metric. That's the work that, you know, Robert alluded to, you know, with Yorkshire Water, which at the moment is seen to be by the UK regulator, Ofwat, as a bit of an advance compared to what Ofwat is at, but something that they're definitely thinking themselves. Because at the moment, a lot of these decisions are made on financial and built or manufactured capital. But in order to look at sea, you need to expand that because it's hard to manage something you can't measure. So going beyond financial and built capital to include natural capital, human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, and it's kind of what we call in some of our work, the 6 capitals approach. You can actually quantify and measure environmental and social impact. And then that gets you to that, which is probably another presentation altogether. So probably something to park, but worth discussing. And this is what the work with Yorkshire Water demonstrated, is that to the public, that the water benefits that it can provide beyond just water in a tap, providing jobs, apprenticeships, storing carbon, managing land biodiversity, reusing materials. And so a good solid first step would be, where is the industry at in terms of maturity? Where are the organizations at?
So what do you think are the natural partners for the water sector to progress this? I mean, the presentation has shown, sometimes architects or local government, but also research organizations and renewable energy organizations. Who do you think the natural partners are for Victoria in the water sector?
I think you've just named some of them. I think that the point in all of this is collaboration, and I think it is trying to understand where we are getting to. Well, I think there's setting the policy at government level, policy for organisations like yourself to set. I think, and then it's a suppliers. It's also actually responding to where society wants to go to, and then seeking that goal together. So multiple stakeholders and participants, I think.
We've got a few more minutes, so I was going to open up the questions to the delegates for the rest of all of the speakers. If you've got any questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A section or even the chat section. But meanwhile, I just wanted to know if you think it would be risky for water corporations to implement measures in the absence of, the regulation framework or government directions on it.
I think we already have a supportive regulatory environment. We've got the Recycling First policy. We've got the Climate Change Act, obviously. And obviously this is driving a number of decisions, the targets to achieve zero carbon emissions, as you've said there, Western Water, with their facilities. There is progress being made. I think that there is a risk. There could be a perceived risk to wait for regulation. And really, we know that climate change is real. We know that depletion of natural resources is real. So there is a risk and costs associated with that. I think what we need to probably do is consider where customers would like us to go. This is probably one for maybe Robert to add to as well in terms of his experience from Europe, and maybe he could add some value in terms of step change or helping us to step change. Certainly my preference is usually to prepare something in advance and get an opportunity of where the opportunities lie. I think the risk is actually in action. So.
Well, if you've got anything else to add, Frederick or Mike or Martin or Rhys, if you have any afterthoughts, this is your chance. We've got a couple more minutes. Next, we've got a 30-minute break until 5 o'clock. So I do encourage you to join the social hour. If there's no other questions, thank you again to all the presenters, and also thank you to the VicWater team. Stellar job doing this conference, fantastic. And it's been a pleasure to moderate this session. I hope to see you all soon, face to face, but we'll catch up perhaps at the social hour. Bye for now.
Livia.
Thank you very much.
Livia, thank you.